Stay tuned for the latest message excerpt from One Community Church.
The first room that David talks about is the courtroom. In verse 3, he says, who forgives all of your iniquities. This room here is the image of a courtroom. It is how God forgives sins. It is how God forgives sins. This courtroom, and imagine going into a courtroom, you're guilty, you have evidence all on you. The DNA is there, the image of the blood. You still got the weapon in your hand and the gun is still hot from you shooting it. You got fragments of the gunpowder all on you. You walk into the courtroom. Across your chest, it says, I did it. Somebody's holding up a sign. You holding up a sign. Your fingerprints are all on the evidence, the crime scene, and you walk into the courtroom as guilty as you are, and the judge looks at you and says, not guilty. I'm trying to get you to understand, how would your praise be? How would your shout be? And this is the kind of flashback memory that David is talking about. See, some of y'all been in church too long, because if you can't shout and celebrate God on redemption of sins or forgiveness of sins, see, when you celebrating because you got a new car, some new glasses, a new jacket, some new shoes, see, that's a cheap praise. That's cheap praise. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about that. That's cheap praise. But what I'm talking about is a costly praise. I need somebody to recognize that it cost God something to say not guilty when you have been judged, when you've been guilty, you're unrighteous, and he looks at you and sees the righteousness of Jesus Christ, and he calls you the righteousness of God. You need to clap your hands when your iniquities. He forgives all your iniquities. But Joseph, he moves from the courtroom in David's flashback of God removing sins, of God forgiving sins, of God. He moves from the courtroom to the hospital room. He says, who heals all your diseases, who heals all your diseases. Now, God, some of you know what I'm talking about. Have you ever been in a situation where you needed God to heal something? Have you ever been in a situation where, and most of us who are over 40, stuff start happening when you didn't even do nothing. You pull something just getting out the bed. You step out the shower and you twist your ankle. How in the world does stuff like this happen? Your knees don't work like they used to. You got pain in your back. It seems like headaches come for no reason. Every fall, it seems like everybody got a sinus infection. Everybody got allergies in Michigan now. How in the world, our physicality, there are things that are happening. The food that we eat affects our bodies. There's stuff in the atmosphere and in the environment that's infecting us. But here's the reality. David has had an experience with God that he can reflect on, that God has healed his infirmities. And some of you got some testimonies in here. Some of you have been in some situations, have had battles with cancer. Some of you, it might not even been you that God has healed, but you're connected to somebody who God is healed. And if you can't celebrate the healing of your child, of your loved one, of your father, your parents, your grandparents, you need to shout on the fact that you serve a God who can heal the infirmities of the sick. And when you can do that, God says, I got the same healing I healed them. It's the same healing that I can touch in your heart. That's the kind of flashback that David was talking about. So he moved Ursula from the courtroom to the hospital room. And then watch this in verse number 4. He says, who redeems your life from the destruction or from the pit. I think the King James, he calls it, he says, who redeems your life from destruction. Watch this. But in another translation, he calls it from the pit. In other words, it means it's the tomb room. It is the death pit. It is the grave pit. It is the place of death. It is the room of death. What David is saying here, I can reflect on a time when God saved me from a deathly situation. Has anybody ever been in a situation where it was a near death experience? David here is talking about that kind kind of season in his life where he saw his life flash before his eyes. David is reflecting on a situation, a time when God literally delivered him from death. David is shouting, David is reflecting, David is celebrating, David is remembering. And I need you to understand right now that all of us have had some near-death experiences, and you should celebrate the time when even if the car that you were in flipped over several times, or the accident that you were in, and some of you had to celebrate the time when you were about 10 years ago when money was a little funny, when all 4 of your tires were bald and the tread was showing, and God somehow put his supernatural hand over that bare tread and allowed you to keep going from point A to point B. You need to celebrate that in that moment. That was a near-death experience. And I'm trying to tell you right now that even if you don't realize it, the fact that you may not realize it does not mean that you did not have a near-death experience. You need to celebrate that even when your children go to school and come back home, there is somebody in a state not far from here whose children did not come home. You need to celebrate that God has saved you for some near-death experiences.
This excerpt was brought to you by One Community Church. To hear the full message, please visit myonechurch.com.